All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Thank you, as always, for taking the time to join us for our lecture series. Today's is with Monte Mallin, who many of you probably know, who's the retired Director of Policy at the National Nuclear Security Administration, and his talk is titled Strategic Defense in an Era of Uncertainty. And as Monty notes, there are many uncertainties now to which Golden Dome is another. And I guess I would equate this to, throwing a big rock in a pond of like one, the splash is very big in terms of a lot of different things, but then there are also ripples that go out sort of all over the pond now that you've done this. And we had a glimpse of this in a lecture we did a week or two ago with a Chinese scholar who basically said, you've announced Golden Dome, everything we were telling you about missile defenses over the last 20 years is right. You were not going to restrain. This was all about us. And you just sort of admitted what we knew all along to be true. And so that's sort of one example of a ripple you're going to see on this topic throughout our lecture. I think it's also useful for Monty to give this talk at this moment because, we at the lab are very focused on the things, on the architecture, on how do we build it, on how does the technologies come together. But that, of course, is only one piece. It's an important piece, but it's only one piece. There's a lot of sort of geopolitical implications of this for our relations with our adversaries, our relations with our allies, on sort of the nuclear balance, on sort of where missile defense fits into this basket of capabilities that we talk about in things like multi-domain, cross-domain, integrated deterrence. And so a lot of the themes that we talk about here at CGSR, a lot of our thrust areas somehow touch on missile defense, and Golden Dome is that thing right now. So a great time for this speaker, a great topic for him to talk on, and a great speaker to have. So let me say a little bit about him. He is a nationally recognized expert in nuclear security, arms control, and strategic foresight. He has nearly 4 decades of experience shaping U.S. policy at the Departments of Energy and State, and at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. He played a central role in multilateral treaty negotiations, managed a number of critical non-proliferation related portfolios, chaired the NNSA's nuclear security portfolio at the National Defense University, and retired as director of policy at the National Nuclear Security Administration. I think you're going to see a lot from him in this talk about sort of his ability, sort of clarity, collaborative leadership, narrative precision, a lot of time spent mentoring the next generation, which is important. I will just put a plug in. So CSIS is doing a series called Negotiator Files, where they interview negotiators from past arms control in order to sort of get lessons from the arms control, present and past, sort of memorialized for future generations of arms control. Like Monty just did one of those, so you can look that up on the CSO website. It's called the Negotiator Files, but you can talk more about that. The ground rules, he is going to speak for about 30 or 45 minutes with some slides. Please raise your hand electronically or submit your questions to me in the chat, type them up. Do that whenever the mood strikes you during his talk, and that way we're ready to go to the discussion. I already have hands that are raised. I already have some questions I can ask, and that just makes my life easier and Monty's life easier as we go through these questions. So Monty, thank you so much for being with us today. Over to you. I will try to find the negotiator file thing, and I'll put a link. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Mike. I appreciate all those comments. I'm assuming I'm on the stage at the moment. I'm not always sure exactly how those things work, but we do have the slides. And while Katie is putting them up, I'll just say thank you to you, Mike, and thank you to, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger there. And thank you to Katie and to Brad, of course. And it's really great to have such a great team who helped make this happen, because I'm personally really, really looking forward to this opportunity to talk. And so let's do that. And what I want to do is just start, if we can go to the next slide, is just to talk about who I am a little bit, because there may not be, just so people know who I am and how I came to this. The key point here is that this has been an enduring interest of mine forever. Back in undergraduate at Oberlin College, I had a professor by the name of Robert Tufts, and he was someone who had been on the National Security Council, or that kind of apparatus, all the way going back to Truman and Eisenhower. And he was one of those, well, if they had only listened to me type, but he had a lot of wisdom, and so it was a great class, and it was about security. But when he talked about the ABM treaty, I was listening to it. My first reaction was just nodding and thinking, that doesn't make any sense. Why would we do that? Why would we purposely leave ourselves completely vulnerable to an attack? But of course, you learn and you understand, and that's that. And so, okay, I got it and moved on. But the issue always stayed with me because I just never had a comfort level with the idea that we're completely vulnerable. But the reality was that it just wasn't really feasible. And I did my master's thesis on a mix of strategic offensive and defensive forces, and I looked at it from many angles. And I always had a distinction in my mind between the concept on the one hand and the reality on the other. So I love the idea, well, why can't we do this? Can't we have some kind of defense around us to protect us from these horrible weapons? But the reality was that the cost, feasibility, technology issues just made it impossible to do. And this was 1983, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Um, you know, so the idea is a good one, but probably just not really realistic. And that was pretty much that. But I always kept an interest in this. And, it's interesting now with Golden Dome coming back, things really seem to be going full circle in a sense that we are once again looking not just at the idea of research and development, which has gone on pretty steady state. And I'll talk about that a little bit, but we're looking at deployment. So let's go to the next slide a little bit, if we could. So the key point here is the one I just made, that this isn't about research and development. This is about deployment. Development is a big part of how the program as we currently know it is structured. But what really makes it different is that Ronald Reagan was a long-term research and development program kind of guy. I don't think Donald Trump is a long-term research and development kind of guy. I think he wants to get this done, and he wants to get it done on a fairly rapid schedule. And it might be a schedule that raises some concerns, and we'll talk about that too. But it's understandable. If you look at how different things are now from where they were back in 1983, you can understand why we're at this place. It's revolutionary in the sense that this is new by making the emphasis on deployment, but it's also very evolutionary. And it's a response to a number of things. One is that the threat environment has radically changed. My guess is I don't need to go through a lot of this kind of stuff with this audience, but essentially what we all know is that back in 1983, it was the height of the Cold War. It was the US and the Soviet Union, or NATO and the Warsaw Pact, however you wanted to look at it. At its height, we had 60,000 nuclear weapons facing each other combined, and that's a lot of nuclear weapons. And when Reagan came out with this idea of SDI and the idea of a major research and development program aimed at making nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete, yes, there were supporters, but it was greeted with a lot of skepticism, and it was also by many just dismissed as a fantasy. And I do have some great stories about some of the folks I met back in those days, but I'll save that for the Q&A if anyone's interested. But it was really not seen. It was seen as almost fanciful, and it's understandable why, given the nature of the threat, just given what we were dealing with at that time. But there's an important thing to point out here, and I'll talk about this also in a little bit, but it was really aimed at a threat that we knew, which was, the ICBMs, the SLBMs, and we understood the threat environment. We knew that was where the Soviets had the majority of their missiles was on land. So it made perfect sense, but it's just not really possible it wasn't something that could be done. And now we have a very different strategic context where we're dealing with any number of threats. We're dealing with concerns over North Korea. China has emerged, and whether they're a near peer, an almost near peer, a peer, or whatever, it's a big concern. And that's the bottom line when it comes to China. And so we have to think about them. And of course, Russia continues to move on with all the things that it's doing, and North Korea. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I think everyone here probably is pretty aware of what we're dealing with now. But we have North Korea. Iran is now no longer constrained by the JCPOA, and they're going to do what they want to do. we have so many regional insecurities, instabilities now that we have to be thinking about. And also, where does missile defense fit in when we do think about those regional instabilities? There's a lot of things here that are different from where they were. So it's only natural to think about if it's possible to introduce something that might help to address the kind of concerns that we're looking at now. And the reality, as I point out there, is that technical innovation has moved forward rapidly. In the SDI days, when this kind of thing was talked about, it was largely in terms of aspirational objectives. You know, we want to do this. We know we need to go in space. The programs weren't there, and there was a lot of good theorizing, and there were studies that were done. What would be good to, where should we put our money? What would make sense to do? Well, that's changed. You know, for one thing, we have limited nuclear defenses deployed. And so we've learned from that. We've learned a lot from that experience. But in addition to that, we have seen the capability to go into space. It's just very different than it was. It's more accessible. It's more affordable. And I mean relatively affordable. I don't think I'll be going, but it's relatively affordable now to launch the kind of satellites that we used to just think about. And I have a little app on my phone called Space Launch, and it shows just how often these, you know, their launches, sometimes not just from SpaceX, but also from other countries and other places within the United States, and it shows it all, and it's just nonstop. It's just nonstop. And so this is different. It used to be you'd have to get as many satellites loaded onto a rocket as you could, get it up there, you know, and hopefully everything would go well. Now you just keep going, and it's a continuous basis. So those are very different things, you know, a different threat environment, a progress in technology, and space being a different domain than it was when it was back in the 1980s. So it's a natural evolution. It's a revolutionary idea to just start to deploy these quickly, but it's a natural evolution in how the role of these defenses are characterized. So let's go to the next slide, please. And again, I know that you guys work on this all the time, and so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but just I'm a big believer in level setting, making sure we're all in the same place. So, you know, if you look at so let's just talk about Golden Dome for a minute so we all have a sense of what it's about. Its objective, as it lays out, there was an executive order on January 27th, and for those of us who don't have access to what is being done on the architecture, it's a bad thing, and I'll come back to that. I think that there needs to be more public discussion, but it's also a good thing in that I can talk about this in kind of an unconstrained way. So, but it does mean that I need to rely on two things, really: the little bit of information that's come from the administration, and that began with an executive order on January 27th, 7 days after the president took the oath of office. And I also spent a lot of time reading the trades, and you get a real sense of what's actually going on behind the scenes by looking at the defense trades, looking at what kind of RFIs, requests for information, and other documents the government is putting out to industry, and looking at how industry is responding. That gives you a sense of, that gives you at least a picture, even if it's not at the level of detail that you might like, the level of granularity that would be good. But overall speaking, I mean, it's to deter and defend U.S. citizens and critical infrastructure against any foreign aerial attack and guarantee the second strike capability. So it's consistent with traditional deterrence objectives, a little bit more emphasis on the defense, but that would be expected given the nature of the program. But it still uses the same terminology, and it's not something that would surprise you if you think about what the president and the administration is trying to do right now. You know, I don't want to go through all of this because you can read it, but it's a multi-layered shield, and that's very, very important. And it includes space-based interceptors very specifically. Now, the next bullet is a really interesting one because this gets to how things have changed so much over the years. The ICBM threat was really what SDI was about. But here you see an acknowledgement that we have to deal with a much different threat environment: hypersonic, cruise missiles, other aerial attacks that could come from any number of places. And this is really something that's different. So this is an extra challenge that Golden Dome has to take on. And when the president announced it, he set a very lofty set of objectives of having this thing, quote, fully operational with a success rate of close to 100 and completed by the end of his term. So that might be on a little bit on the ambitious side, and also the cost that he laid out of 175 billion might be a little bit on the low side. The estimates range from that to the trillions of dollars, and it really depends on what is being done. I'll give a little shout out to Todd Harrison at AEI, who's been doing some great work thinking through different architectures and what we might expect. And I really, on this slide, I just want to really draw your attention to the last point, because as I think about all of this, it has to have a robust role for the allies. We need to be thinking about what their interests are, not only in the extended deterrence sense, but also in the sense of the capabilities that they are developing. France and others have very robust programs in this area. They are going at it full force. They're looking to space as a force multiplier. So there's a lot we can do if we work together with our allies. And the executive order does say that an allied and theater missile defense review would be an expedited priority. So that's a good thing. And let's just go to the next slide for a second, please. And what you see here, I've captured all of this, but I just thought I'd put it all into one place. This really captures the differences between SDI and Golden Dome. And I don't want to go through all of this right now, but the takeaway distinction, because I think I covered most of it, but the last line is what I do want to talk about. SDI was aspirational. From Caspar Weinberger's perspective, it was a moral choice. It was something we had to do. And that's a very interesting perspective, but it was aspirational. But I think with Golden Dome, it's a different attitude. It's about deployment, about getting her done. And so that's what you see there. So I don't feel I need to go too deep into this slide. If people want to, we can always come back to it. But that's the basic gist of it. And I really think when I think about this challenge, I always think about it in terms of what is actually required to get this done, and how is it going to be done, and what is the Pentagon saying about that, and are they giving this enough time? Are they thinking this through enough? And I think these are very serious issues. If we go to the next slide, this is also another one that I don't need to spend a lot of time on, particularly with this crowd, but I have it there because I'm going to be talking about these things very, very often throughout this talk. So the boost phase is the first 2-3 minutes of a missile after its launches, which goes to the booster burnout. The mid-course is where you have a little bit more time as it goes through space. And then the terminal is the reentry and descent to target. Again, I only have this here because I think it's important that we all are kind of talking on the same page and we understand it. And that way, as I go through this, I don't have to feel particularly like I have to keep going back to that. So that just gives you a sense of it. And if we go to the next slide, I think here's where it becomes interesting to me as I think about this Golden Dome. And I'm going to talk first a little bit about some of the technology related challenges and then later I'll talk about some of the strategic and policy issues that Mike has mentioned. But if you look at this, as I said, a lot of these, as I look at Golden Dome and how it's developing from an outsider's perspective, I kind of see 4 decision clusters, 4 big picture issues that are going to have to be dealt with. And within those issues are more issues, and within those decisions are more decisions. But these kind of capture it for me as I think about it. And the first really has to do with the non-space-based defensive systems, which is sometimes referred to as the underlayer, and I'll come back to what that is. Second is the militarization of the space domain, and I use the word very carefully, militarization as opposed to weaponization, and I'm making a distinction there. Where are we going to go with that, and how far and how fast? And then after that, you could almost put a break there because now you are talking about putting in weapons in space. When you get to the third cluster of decisions, you're talking about space-based interceptors or perhaps other tools that could be used someday as we do move into space. So let's talk about each of these 4. And the fourth one is, boost phase. And that's where we start to get into some really challenging issues, in my opinion. I would say they're challenging throughout the whole thing, but I think this gives you a sense, in my mind at least, of how I think about the various sets of challenges that are that the Golden Dome is up against. And I'm not really a technologist. I'm not getting too deep into the technology aspects of it, but this gives you a broad kind of sense of how I think about it. And if we go to the next slide, this is the ground and underlayer systems. There's a decision within the decision. Do we expand the role of these systems beyond where they are now, which is limited CONUS defense and specific forward deployed missions? So let's talk about a layered defense, and because this is a concept that also is going to come back throughout the next set of comments. The idea of the layered defense is by having multiple layers, you give yourself more opportunities to successfully attack the incoming missile or cruise missile or whatever it is, and therefore you increase your odds of success. And it's a very straightforward concept, but it's a very important one because that is really how you're going to determine the success of this, given the amount of challenges you're going to face as you do this. So what we're really talking about here are two types of systems. One are the terminal systems that we're familiar with, like THAAD, Aegis, and Patriot. But then you also have the mid-course defense, and that's the ground-based mid-course defense. There's currently efforts to modernize that. And this is where you start to expand the CONUS footprint a little bit, and you start to think about how can this really potentially support our allies and our global posture. So if the first set of issues is really focused on these systems, then you come up with a very interesting question of, well, to what extent, and do you want to try to expand these systems? And my personal view is that this is kind of the key to a lot of this. You have to be able to do this. You have to be able to have that, because the rest, as you go further and as you get into space and as you do these things and you look for boost phase, then it becomes a whole different kind of challenge. So this is where I would think is really the first set of decisions. How are we going to handle expanding these systems that I just kind of described? So going to the next slide, this is what I would call the second decision cluster, and this really has to do with expanding our military presence in space. And I'm going to have a slide that I think that I'm looking forward to showing you the next slide. Let's put it that way. But really, this isn't something that we're just doing because it's a cool thing to do. This is really something that we're really given no choice. China is very aggressive in what it's doing in space, as is Russia, as is others. And what's interesting about this is that, I guess the point I'm making is that all of those things lead us to have to continue to do the things that we're doing. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. And what's interesting about the executive order is that it calls out a number of very specific systems. And all of this is essential to not only directing and managing a ballistic missile defense if it's deployed, but also to just making sure that other things that we do, ground-based, other mission areas are covered, that there's coordination. This is essential to supporting the Golden Dome missions. And this is something we're going to be doing, and we were already doing before there was a Golden Dome. So it would be great to say that, maybe there are ways to control, maybe create some communications among the main powers. But for the moment, I think it's pretty understandable why we're moving forward on this kind of thing. But let's go to the next slide for just a second, because it's a little break from yeah, there you go. And I promise I am not asking you to read this slide, nor do I have any intention of reading it myself. But what I did here was I went through all the systems that are listed in the executive order on the left. And then I looked at all the different where they supported throughout the government. And what's so interesting about this is that all of these things really lay out the elements of an architecture, even if it's not an architecture itself. This is another reason why we need to be thinking about this in terms of deployment so much. These are systems where a lot of money has already been spent. In some cases, they're very advanced. We need to be thinking about how, what is the next step in command and control, and to make sure that all of these things work together and are interoperable, even when they weren't designed to do so. And the right column is simply showing, as I counted it, there's almost a dozen agencies listed there that are involved in all of these kind of programs to one degree or another. And that's pretty important. So if you look at the very last line, there's a Golden Dome Program Office now. It's led by General Michael Gutlein. He was confirmed in July, and he has a lot of authority, and he's the one who's really going to be directing this. but he's the one who's going to be determining, how do we build this program up? How do we draw on these systems? How do we make sure that all of these different agencies are talking to each other and are coordinated? And he's got some work on his hands. So I just find this to be a very interesting slide because it really shows you the complexity of the challenge that we're looking at right now. And also it shows just how many different offices have an interest in this. And that's something that's going to have to be managed really indefinitely if you think about strategic defense. All right, let's go to the next slide. And this is what I call the third cluster. And here's where I say you're making the leap, because now you are putting weapons in space. And what I did, I divided up into two set of issues. One is really, if you're going to make that leap, what are you going to do? And so there's a lot of analysis right now on this idea of using the space-based interceptors, which are still being, under development and all, using them for a mid-course defense. So you're strengthening the underlayer that I just described a moment ago and the mid-course defense that I just described a minute ago. So if you make the decision, if you're ready to make that leap, that you're going to go ahead and deploy these things, but boost phase might seem a little bit unrealistic for the moment, maybe this is something that's worth thinking about. And I want to draw your point to the bullet that says it strengthens layered defense in the context of the earlier comments that I was making. If this really can, this is something that would, as I understand it, and again, I'm not a technologist, but my understanding is this would require many fewer of these weapons than if you tried to do this as a boost phase kind of operation. It gives you longer engagement time, fewer required. And interestingly, it's important to note the June RFI, the request for information, specifically asked industry to be focusing on this possibility. Now, it's not all, it's not all roses. These will be vulnerable to ASAT, cyber attacks, other directed energy type attacks, all kinds of other countermeasures. They're only really viable with a robust command and control architecture to support them. And I keep coming back to that point. We really have to make a decision about whether we're ready to take that leap to take a concrete weaponization of the space environment. So to me, that's the third set of decisions that are really going to have to be dealt with. And that gets to the fourth one, if we can go up one more slide. And this is where you get into boost phase and a concept called left of launch. Now, this is a long-term proposition. It will be costly. We're not ready to do it now. We're not going to be ready in the next few years. One of the main thing that's talked about and that's called out specifically in the executive order are the SBIs. But there are potentially others down the road. We can think about directed energy weapons. There's other things that can be thought about, but this is all down the road. It really can't be emphasized enough. The number of the things that you'll need, the SBIs and the satellites to support them, is probably measured in the thousands. And there's a real issue called the absentee issue, which is that basically the satellites have to be right there where the missiles are when the missiles take off. And that's a challenge. So that's why you have these numbers. That's why you need so many of these things. That's something we really have to be thinking about. So it does, if you can do boost phase, that's going to increase your layers. It's going to be much more effective, but it's a real set of challenges that come with that. And then there's this other idea that's also specifically mentioned in the executive order, which is this idea of left of launch. And I will just tell you, it gets me a little nervous. What are the rules of engagement and the stability implications? How does the adversary, on what basis do you make the judgment that the adversary is about to use the weapons? On what do you use to take out those weapons left of launch? This is something I think that it's easy to say. It would be great if we just took the missiles out before they even took off. But let's really think that through and make sure that's something we want to do. But again, this is all part of a bigger picture. So if we go to the next slide, I want to talk about where I really think the Pentagon is getting it right. I think their approach is exactly on target, and they've identified what they call epochs. Each 2 years, epochs, each 2 years, and they emphasize deployment, yes, but also development, and that's really important. And the second one ends in December 2028. I don't think that's coincidental. The fourth goes to 2030 and beyond. That's not trivial because of a number of things, and I list them there. One is that the reality is that deploying and maintaining strategic defense is never done. You never say, "Well, I did it, and I win, and there's nothing the adversary can do." It's a cat and mouse game. It's an arms race, and it takes on a whole new dimension when you do this. So, in that sense, you have to have that fourth one that goes from 2030 and beyond because it gives you that. Um, but by ending the second epic in December of 2028, right before the president leaves office, it gives them the opportunity to declare victory. And what I would expect is that when the architecture comes out, and again, it might already have, I don't know, but what you'll see is that there's some very specific milestones that will be achievable at that time. And that gives the president the ability to say, well, look, we did it. We did it. We set out a goal and we achieved it. It also recognizes that the next president may have a different view on all of this. And if you look at the whole history since really, well, first Reagan had a very different view than his predecessors, if you go back to the ABM treaty. But then building on that, George Bush basically scaled it down, and then Bill Clinton scaled it even further. George Bush came in and he withdrew us from the ABM treaty and had some very different ideas about what the purpose was for all of these things. And then if you look at the 2020 Missile Defense Review, and I have a backup slide where I detail this if people are interested, but if you look at the backup slide, if you look at the 2022 Missile Defense Review, the Biden administration, it really takes a very much more aggressive approach to talk about the role of defenses in our strategic posture. And so in that sense, these things change. Sometimes they get more aggressive, sometimes they step back a little bit. So I think by structuring it the way they did, they've given themselves some flexibility there. And I think that was smart. And then the final thing is that at least it will facilitate some contract management, which is important for industry. The one thing I hear is that industry itself, generally speaking, would really like a little bit more information about what this is all about. And that way they can plan. And so they're really looking forward to seeing the architecture that's under development and is being briefed in the Pentagon. I'm sure some have, but it's my impression is that a lot haven't. And I think they'll be able to plan a lot better if they see exactly what the expectations are over the course of these four tranches. So I'm going to give the Pentagon a lot for how they're planning this, and I hope that stays as the general outline for where this goes. But I want to turn away from some of these questions to some of the strategic implications. And if we can go to the next slide, please. And I'm going to take a little sip. So, I probably need to brush off my thesis because, but there's a lot of questions here. Are we establishing a new deterrence paradigm? I mean, at no time before has the idea that deterrence is based on strategic offensive forces been challenged. That will never be challenged. I mean, as long as we have them, they're going to be the core of our deterrent. But what happens when you move from limited missile defenses, which have very constrained roles and very specific roles as they do now, to something that's a little bit more robust? Then you're talking about you're starting to move, especially in an era now where we've had a lot of arms control and we're down to about 1,500 deployed forces plus others. Then you have to think, well, what does this balance mean? This is a whole new kind of conversation that we have. So I hope that conversation will, in fact, take place. And I think that that's where all of us can help advance the thinking with respect to that, because there's different ways to look at it. And when back in the grad school days, there was an author by the name of Donald Snow who talked about a strategy of uncertainty. And I think what he was really getting at is complex, but I think if we put it in modern terminology, he's talking about raising the threshold that Russia, for example, would have more doubts about whether a first strike would be successful. And so they would be more constrained in even contemplating doing it. And so raising the threshold is a factor, but there's a lot more. And there's also the potential for a lot more instabilities when you're talking about this kind of deterrence mix. So that's something I think we need to really think about. I talked about arms racing a little bit. I think we are opening the door to a new level of arms control, of arms racing. And I think that that's something very serious because, we've been down this road before. And is this the way we want to go? Or do we want to think about whether there's any possibilities down the road for constraining some of this? And I think the Pentagon's plan gives us a little bit of that option. I can't say enough about how important it is to be thinking through the extended deterrence implications. And this is something that will directly impact the allies in terms of what they do, as well as in terms of their thinking about what we may or may not do. This is called the full name of this initiative is the Golden Dome for America. I mentioned that it also talks about the Allied Review, but that's what it is. It's the Golden Dome for America. Now, we'd be remiss not on a technological level to take advantage of what the allies are doing, and I talked about that. And when I say allies, I should clarify, I tend to think in terms of NATO allies. I'm an old guy, but obviously it goes beyond that to our European partners. Our Asian our partners in Asia, but there's a lot of things we have to be thinking about in terms of not only leveraging their technological assets, but also in terms of the extended deterrence requirements, how they are perceived. So I hope we go very, very carefully with that. Now, you can talk about all this stuff all you want, but if you don't talk about the costs, then you're not really giving it a full consideration. I mentioned that the administration has talked about 175 billion, but I have to say, I have not seen any other estimate based on close to that number. Even the estimates that try to be on the conservative side tend to be a lot higher than that. And I've seen estimates in the trillions. It all depends on what you do, what you're planning to do, all of those things. But, we're asking the American people to pay for something that could be in the trillions of dollars. And we better be clear on how we articulate that requirement. And if we have to be clear about other budgetary requirements, and we have to think about, are there other ways to get to a better place where maybe we're not spending quite as much money. I mentioned the enormous command and control challenges. I think that's something that we have to, I won't go on that for right now. I won't detail that right now. I've talked about it, but I do want to mention that part of that, though, the part I do want to single out is the role of AI, machine learning, other such tools in the decision-making process. And if you really go for the full boost phase route and you have to make many, many decisions very, very quickly, are you getting to a point where you say, well, can AI not only facilitate, but maybe make the decisions? And the decisions are, for example, is that a decoy? Is that something we want to try to actually target? So we really should be thinking about that, not only from the cautionary perspective I just laid out, but also from the opportunistic one. AI is there, and it could be something that we find to be helpful. But the last point I want to make on this slide, and this is something that, Reagan was aspirational. I'm not comparing myself to Reagan, but maybe I'm a little aspirational too. We should at least look at whether there are opportunities for diplomatic engagement. Can we develop some kind of rules of the road for deployment or for space activities? There was a recent incident where China contacted us and said, you'll see some movement in our satellites, but do not worry, we have this under control. It was unintended, and they worked it out. And that kind of communication, when I find arms control maybe a little bit far off, but at least talking to each other, looking for confidence building measures, maybe a little bit more transparency in what we do. I think that that's something that's at least worth exploring. So I want to mention that because, as I said, it never hurts to be aspirational, right? Or maybe even a little bit naive. So, but let me go to my final slide here just for a moment. And so, just some final thoughts to leave you with. I do see merit in expanding the underlayer and in making sure that ongoing programs continue, as we talked about. I do have concerns about going too fast, but there's not too much I can talk about that, given that I really have not seen the architecture. And the one thing that really heartens me, by the way, is that General Gutlein has called the command and control issues associated with Golden Dome a high priority. And he's aware of all the challenges in terms of sensors and tracking and management and all the other things that have to be done to make this work. And he knows that all of those systems that I talked about have to work together, which is a challenge unto itself. He's aware of all this, and he's made that a priority. So I think that gives me some hope, and I think that will calibrate, or at least have some influence on the decisions that are made. I just can only hope that some of these strategic implications we talked about are well thought through, and I really want to keep the door open on diplomacy. And two final points I want to make is that, one, it's not our nature as a country to turn our back on technological progress. I can't see us putting all these genies back in the bottle. We just never do that. And given the technological capacity, not only at Livermore, not only at all the NNSA plants and sites, but also in industry, which is a key partner to making this whole thing work, and also at the universities, which are also going to invariably going to be brought in for some of the technological prowess that they can bring. That's a lot of leadership and technology that we have. And so I'm really going to look to see that we may not turn our back on all this, but at the same time, there is a way to do this in a way that makes sense. And so I think that's something that's worth watching very closely. And the final point I'll just make is that, as I mentioned from the outside, the government is very close hold in all of this. There's risks to that. You have to build congressional support. You have to build public support. And you have to, show that you have a plan in place. Now, maybe that will change once we see the actual architecture that comes out. But I think that it's actually beneficial to have the public kind of discourse and discussion that something of this gravity just calls out for. So those are my final thoughts. And let's go ahead and have some discussion. And thank you. And you can put the slides down at this point.